in 80 Days, Chapter 15, in which the bag of banknotes disgorges some thousands of pounds more. The train entered the station, and Passepartout, jumping out first, was followed by Mr. Fogg, who assisted his fair companion to descend. Phileas Fogg intended to proceed at once to the Hong Kong steamer, in order to get Aouda comfortably settled for the voyage. He was unwilling to leave her while they were still in dangerous ground. Just as he was leaving the station, a policeman came up to him and said, "Mr. Phileas Fogg?" "I am he." "Is this man your servant?" added the policeman, pointing to Passepartout. "Yes." "Be so good, both of you, as to follow me." Mr. Fogg betrayed no surprise whatsoever. The policeman was representative of the law, and the law is sacred to an Englishman. Passepartout tried to reason about the matter, but the policeman tapped him with his stick, and Mr. Fogg made a signal for him to obey. "May this young lady go with us?" asked he. "She may," replied the policeman. Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout were conducted in a palkigari, a sort of four-wheeled carriage drawn by two horses, in which they took their places and were driven away. No one spoke during the 20 minutes which elapsed before they reached their destination. They first passed through the Black Town, with its narrow streets, its miserable dirty huts, and squalid population, then through the European town, which presented a relief in its bright brick mansions, shaded by coconut trees and bristling with masts, where, although it was very early morning, elegantly dressed horsemen in handsome equipages were passing back and forth. The carriage stopped before a modest-looking house, which, however, did not have the appearance of a private mansion. The policeman, having requested his prisoners, for so truly they might be called, to descend, conducted them into a room with barred windows, and said, "You will appear before Judge Obadiah at 8:30. There he retired and closed the door. "Why, we are prisoners!" exclaimed Passepartout, falling into a chair. Aouda, with an emotion she tried to conceal, said to Mr. Fogg, "Sir, you must leave me to my fate. It is only on my account you receive this treatment. It is for having saved me." Phileas Fogg contented himself with saying that it was impossible. It was quite unlikely that they should be arrested for preventing a settee. The complaints would not dare present themselves with such a charge. There was some mistake. Moreover, he would not, in any event, abandon Aouda, but would escort her to Hong Kong. "But the steamer leaves at noon," observed Passepartout nervously. "We shall be on board by noon," replied his master placidly. It was said so positively that Passepartout could not help but mutter to himself, "Parbleu, that's not certain. Before noon we shall be on board," but he was by no means reassured. At 8:30 the door opened, the policeman appeared, and requesting them to follow him, led the way to an adjoining hall. It was evidently a courtroom, and a group of Europeans and natives already occupied the rear of the apartment. Mr. Fogg and his two companions took their places on a bench opposite the desks of the magistrate and the clerk. Immediately after, Judge Obadiah, a fat, round man, followed by the clerk, entered. He proceeded to take a wig down which was hanging on a nail, and put it hurriedly on his head. "The first case," said he, then, putting his hand to his head, exclaimed, "This isn't my wig." "No, your lordship," returned the clerk, "it's mine." "My dear Mr. Oysterpuff, how can a judge give a wise sentence in a clerk's wig?" The wigs were exchanged. Passepartout was getting nervous, for the hands of the face of the big clock over the judge seemed to go around with terrible rapidity. "The first case," repeated Judge Obadiah. "Phileas Fogg?" demanded Oysterpuff. "I'm here," replied Mr. Fogg. "Passepartout?" "Present," responded Passepartout. "Good," said the judge. "You've been looked for prisoners for 2 days on the trains from Bombay." "But of what are we accused?" asked Passepartout impatiently. "You are about to be informed." "I am an English subject, sir, and I have the right—" "Have you been ill-treated?" "Not at all." "Very well, let the complainants come in." A door was swung open by the judge, and 3 Indian priests entered. "That's it," muttered Passepartout. "These are the rogues who are going to burn our young lady." The priests took their place in front of the judge, and the clerk proceeded to read a loud-voiced complaint of sacrilege against Phileas Fogg and his servant, who were accused of having violated a place held consecrated by the Brahmin religion. "You hear the charge?" asked the judge. Yes, sir, replied Mr. Fogg, consulting his watch, and I'll admit it. You admit it? I admit it, and I wish to have these priests admit, in turn, what they were going to do with the pagoda of Pelagi. The priests looked at each other, and they did not seem to understand what was said. Yes, cried Passepartout, at the pagoda of Pelagi, where they were on the point of burning their victim. The judge stared with astonishment, and the priests were stupefied. What victim? Said Judge Obadiah. Burn whom? In Bombay itself? Bombay! Cried Passepartout. Certainly, we're not talking about the pagoda of Pelagi, but the pagoda of Malabar Hill at Bombay. And as proof, added the clerk, here are the desecrator's very shoes which he left behind him. Whereupon he placed a pair of shoes on his desk. My shoes! Cried Passepartout, his surprise permitting this imprudent exclamation to escape him. The confusion of master and man, who had quite forgotten the affair at Bombay, for which they were now detained in Calcutta, might be imagined. Fix, the detective, had foreseen the advantage which Passepartout's escapade gave him, and, delaying his departure for 12 hours, consulted the priests of Malabar Hill. Knowing that the English authorities dealt very severely with this kind of misdemeanor, he promised them a goodly sum in damages, and sent them forward to Calcutta by the next train. Owing to the delay caused by the rescue of the young widow, Fix and the priests reached the Indian capital before Mr. Fogg and his servant, the magistrates having been already warned by a dispatch to arrest them should they arrive. Fix's disappointment when he learned that Phileas Fogg had not made his appearance in Calcutta may be imagined. He made up his mind that the robber had stopped somewhat along the route and taken refuge in the southern provinces. For 24 hours Fix watched the station with feverish anxiety. At least he was rewarded by seeing Mr. Fogg and Passepartout arrive, accompanied by a young woman, whose presence was wholly at a loss to explain. He hastened for a policeman, and this was how the party came to be arrested and brought before Judge Obadiah. Had Passepartout been a little less preoccupied, he would have espied the detective ensconced in a corner of the courtroom, watching the proceedings with interest easily understood, for the warrant had failed to reach him at Calcutta as it had done at Bombay and Suez. Judge Obadiah unfortunately caught Passepartout's rash exclamation, which the poor fellow would have given the world to recall. The facts are admitted? Asked the judge. Admitted, replied Mr. Fogg coldly. Inasmuch, resumed the judge, as the English law protects equally and sternly the religions of the Indian people, and as the man Passepartout has admitted that he violated the sacred pagoda of Malabar Hill at Bombay on the 20th of October, I condemn the said Passepartout to imprisonment for 15 days and a fine of £300. £300! Cried Passepartout, startled at the largeness of the sum. Silence! Shouted the constable. And inasmuch, continued the judge, as it is not proved that the act was not done at the convenient connivance of the master with the servant, and as the master in any case must be held responsible for the acts of his paid servant, I condemn Phileas Fogg to a week's imprisonment and a fine of £150. Fix rubbed his hands softly with satisfaction. If Phileas Fogg could be detained in Calcutta a week, it would be more than time for the warrant to arrive. Passepartout was stupefied. This sentence ruined his master. A wager of £20,000 lost because he, like a precious fool, had gone into that abominable pagoda. Phileas Fogg is self-composed as if the judgment did not move the least concern him, did not even lift his eyebrows while it was being pronounced. Just as the clerk was calling the next case, he rose and said, I offer bail. You have the right, returned the judge. Fix's blood ran cold, but he resumed his composure, which he had heard the judge announce that the bail required for each prisoner would be £1,000. I will pay it at once, said Mr. Fogg, taking a roll of bank bills from the carpet bag, which Passepartout had by him, and placing them on the clerk's desk. This sum will be restored to you upon your release from prison, said the judge. Meanwhile, you are liberated on bail. Come, said Phileas Fogg to his servant. But let them at least give me back my shoes, cried Passepartout angrily. Ah, these are pretty dear shoes, he muttered as they were handed to him. More than £1,000 apiece. Besides, they pinch my feet. Mr. Fogg, offering his arm to Aouda, then departed, followed by the crestfallen Passepartout. Fix still nourished hopes that the robber would not, after all, leave the £2,000 behind him, but would decide to serve out his week in jail, issued forth on Mr. Fogg's traces. The gentleman took a carriage, and the party were soon landed on one of the quays. The Rangoon was moored half a mile off the harbour, a signal of its departure hoisted at the masthead. 11 o'clock was striking. Mr. Fogg was an hour in advance of time. Fix saw them leave the carriage and push off in a boat for the steamer, and stamped his feet with disappointment. "The rascal is off, after all," he exclaimed. £2,000 sacrificed. He's as prodigal as a thief. I'll follow him to the end of the world if necessary, but at this rate he's going on, the stolen money will soon be exhausted. The detective was not far wrong in making his conjecture. Since leaving London, what with the travelling expenses, bribes, the purchase of the elephant, bails, and fines, Mr. Fogg had already spent more than £5,000 on the way, and the percentage of the sum recovered from the bank robber promised to the detective was rapidly diminishing. This is the end of chapter 15. Now, remember back a few chapters, the bank robbery, and there was a reward promised of a cut of whatever money was recovered. So it was 10%. So there were £35,000 stolen. If it were all recovered, that would be $3,500. Good chunk of money. But now Fogg is spending money left, right, and center. I mean, buy an elephant. Skip out on bail. That's £4,000 right there. That's just like a tremendous amount of money. That's more money than Passepartout would make in a year. So this is just huge, insane amounts of money. That Fogg is just like, okay, spend this, spend that, spend the other thing. And, maybe he'll make it back at the end. But here you have Fix who's following him, and he's like, he's spending all my reward. Assuming, of course, that Fogg robbed the bank. Which, Fix is like, oh, yes, he seems like such an honest man. He has to be a bank robber. Which is kind of convoluted. But, so here we have everybody on a ship called the Rangoon on their way to Hong Kong. So it's another boat trip. So it was train to boat. So by train across Europe. Boat through the Mediterranean, through the Red Sea, over to India. Train across India. Boat from India now to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is part of China. Well, is now part of China. It wasn't part of China then. It was an independent English colony. So here you have Hong Kong, which is part of England and then connected to China. And now it's part of China because they gave it back 20-something years ago now. Wow. It's been a really long time since England gave back Hong Kong to China. Anyway, Fogg is off to China. He skipped out on bail, but the judge and everybody kind of knew that was going to happen. It's like, yeah, we're traveling. We'll post bail. And yeah, Fogg and Passepartout could get back the £2,000 if they hung out for 2 weeks in India. But they can't do that with Aouda because she's being chased by people who want to kill her. So, will Fogg ever return? Well, we find out. Does it really matter? Don't know.